this fits within a broader philosophy in Stoicism, which is about placing more value, more importance on the way that we behave from moment to moment, trying to live wisely each moment of the day, but also recognizing, that in the grand scheme of things, there's much more to the story of the universe than the events that happen to befall us.
Today I'm speaking with Donald Robertson. Donald is a philosopher, a cognitive behavioral therapist, and an author. He's written several books, which include The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, and most recently, How to Think Like Socrates. So, Donald, welcome and thanks so much for your time today.
Well, it's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
So you've written extensively about both philosophy and psychotherapy, and more specifically, a subset of that being cognitive behavioral therapy. If we begin with philosophy, how would you introduce someone to that topic?
Well, people sometimes say philosophy is thinking about thinking, In the West, philosophy really originates with the Socratic tradition, like following Socrates. And for Socrates, philosophy was really about reflecting on what he considers to be the most important things in life, our fundamental values, how we define the goal of life, how we define the qualities that we most admire in other people, like wisdom, justice, courage, self-discipline, and spotting contradictions in our thinking, clarifying our definition of concepts that we take for granted when we're making important moral decisions. So, that's originally what philosophy was about in the Socratic tradition. And then Stoic philosophy is an offshoot of that, developed about 100 years after Socrates died. The Stoic philosophy, it really focuses on the ethical side and the psychological side of what Socrates was saying, and teaches people techniques for developing psychological resilience. But it's based on a moral philosophy that says that our character traits, our virtues, as the Greeks say, are the only truly important thing in life, and that they're fundamentally more important than external things like wealth and reputation, basically. So that's how I define philosophy, and what I'd say about Stoic philosophy, which is my main kind of inspiration.
Yeah, that's great. And you can see already, as someone who knows a little bit about cognitive behavioral therapy, how that links in. But for someone who's new to it, would you mind defining that and then explaining how the two do relate?
Cognitive behavioral therapy is the leading evidence-based form of modern psychotherapy. It kind of developed in the 1950s, actually. It didn't really become kind of mainstream until about the 1980s, though. And now it dominates like what research-based psychotherapy looks like. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a mixture of cognitive psychology and behavioral psychology. They're two different traditions in psychology. Behavioral psychology has got more to do with conditioning, like Pavlov and Skinner and stuff like that. Cognitive psychology is the study of, by cognition, we mean our thoughts and our beliefs, basically. So cognitive behavioral therapy was inspired to a large extent by a particular passage in Epictetus, one of the Stoic philosophers, that says it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. And that's a really neat way of encapsulating what I would sometimes call the cognitive or the thinking model of emotion, which basically says that our emotions are much more shaped by our underlying beliefs, our way of thinking, than we normally assume. So clarifying what those thoughts are allows us then to challenge them, change them, and changing our thoughts can change our feelings. So that's the kind of connection between the two things.
And as we'll get into as the interview progresses, the Stoics in particular had some very practical ways of challenging some of our assumptions, some of our belief thoughts, and looking at them from a different light, which, as you said, if you can change the way you interpret events or think about events, can actually have real-world effects on your life.
Yeah.
In your book, The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, you touched on B.F. Skinner before, and you opened in one of your first chapters with a quote from him, which I thought was quite interesting. And Skinner states that subjects from the ancients, so ancient physics, ancient biology, those sorts of things, are of interest today only because of their historical value. So we look back and they're of interest, but they have no real world application today. So, for example, if you and I had a physics problem that we wanted to solve today, we would be wise to consult with the latest developments in physics, clearly, and not defer back to what people thought 2,000 years ago. You argue, and I obviously agree with it, that philosophy is different. There's something about philosophy and some of the wisdom contained in philosophy from 2,000 years ago that is very relevant today. What do you think it is that they got so right about their thinking back then?
Well, I would say I'm a little bit puzzled by this, and I don't fully know the answer as to why philosophy still seems so relevant today, or certain parts of it. I think, in part, we're used to thinking of scientific progress because as technology advances, scientific method advances, we have computers and we have technology, we have all sorts of things in the modern world that they didn't have in the ancient world. But in some ways, ancient thinkers were surprisingly sophisticated compared to us today. Actually, another example that's kind of adjacent to philosophy is rhetoric. So educated Greeks and Romans had a highly sophisticated understanding of rhetoric, or the art of persuasion, the art of using public speaking to persuade people, maybe even to manipulate audiences and so on. And we can study that, but generally speaking, most educated people today have far less understanding of that subject than someone like Socrates or Marcus Aurelius would. Marcus Aurelius trained in rhetoric throughout his entire adult life under the two leading experts in the world at the time in Greek and Latin. And so in some ways, ancient thinkers are much more sophisticated in that regard, and they sometimes have a much more sophisticated understanding of philosophy than most of us do today. They're better at spotting logical fallacies, arguably. Socrates, I really mean this, although it sounds a bit silly. Socrates in some ways reminds me of Jimi Hendrix, right? Because he's like the Jimi Hendrix of philosophy. I heard once that Jimi Hendrix used to take his guitar to bed. He would fry breakfast in the morning, still wearing his guitar. He'd go to the toilet with his guitar strapped around him. Socrates did philosophy all day, every day, like for most of his adult life. He tells us that. That's extraordinary. And when he says he did philosophy, he's not sitting in a library reading a book. He means that he's engaging in philosophical debate with his friends or with strangers all day long, like every day. Can you imagine? And if you look at how he's doing it, spotting contradictions, clarifying definitions, like the refinement of his ability to reason must have been extraordinary. If you imagine going to the gym, training, like you go to the gym maybe for a few hours a week or something like that, or maybe a bit more. But Socrates was training his his philosophy muscles all day, every day. Like he's a sort of Olympic athlete of reasoning, if you like. There's no coincidence that he had so much impact. And I think in the ancient world as well, maybe people simply had more opportunity, fewer distractions, more opportunity sometimes to engage in calm reflection on the meaning of life, on their values. They often seem to ask much more fundamental questions than we do today. I mean, how often do we sit down, unless you're like you or I, maybe we're doing philosophy podcasts and things like that. But generally speaking, we don't talk to people that much about, the meaning of death, coming to terms with our own mortality, questioning the prevailing values of our entire society, exploring what the concept of wisdom is. Now, one of the things as a young guy that really grabbed me about Socrates was he was asking really deep questions, even more fundamental than many modern academic philosophers are. Sometimes modern academic philosophy kind of gets stuck in like niches that are quite technical and a little bit divorced from living in the real world, as it were. Socrates kept his focus consistently on really fundamental questions that nevertheless directly relate to how we live our lives.
I think something you touch on there is really important, which is the fact that if we wanted to learn or to think about the way to conduct ourselves, the right way to approach life, what the deeper meaning of life is, what our core values are, we could do a lot better than walk into a university department and speak to a philosopher, a professor of philosophy in 2024 about these questions. There's a real disconnect between someone, as you said, who reads a textbook for a couple of hours a day and debates these metaphysical problems that perhaps don't really have real world application in our everyday life, and someone like Socrates or Marcus Aurelius, who you introduced earlier, who lived and breathed it and actually practiced the philosophy for life.
Some of my best friends are philosophy professors, and my first degree was in philosophy, and I loved it, and I got a lot from it. But when I graduated from my philosophy degree, there was still this kind of yearning within me. Like I felt like I'd come close to grasping something that was really important, but I hadn't really hit the nail on the head. I was still left feeling that I lacked something. And then I discovered Stoicism, and everything kind of clicked for me. I thought, this speaks to me. It seems to be the type of philosophy that I was looking for. And then I discovered really Socrates was the kind of godfather of Stoicism, is how I think of him.
Yeah. One of the key things you mentioned, Stoicism and particularly Socrates, that strikes me as relevant and very important is that it stresses the importance of looking inwards for fulfillment. So culturally, we're conditioned, I suppose, to seek external achievements. So things like wealth or status, improvement in external things. But the philosophers really stress the importance of looking inwards. You touched on core values and virtues before. And in fact, they talk about cultivating something called eudaimonia. Would you mind defining that and explain from maybe a health and wellbeing perspective how looking inwards for success can lead to more flourishing throughout life?
I think if I can give the concise version of that. Eudaimonia is an unusual word in Greek. And literally it means something like having a good relationship with your daimonos, which is like a spirit, a supernatural being, like maybe your higher self or a spirit that dwells within you. So it has this kind of metaphorical meaning originally, but what it's actually used to mean in ancient Greek is fulfillment. Sometimes it's translated as happiness, but fulfillment or flourishing would be a better translation, because the Greeks define it as the state of mind or the condition of somebody who has everything good, i.e. they're living the best possible life. So it's the optimum state, the peak state for a human being, essentially, fundamentally. So that's eudaimonia. And ancient philosophers would argue about how to define it. You could distinguish one school of philosophy from another based on how they chose to define what flourishing or fulfillment consists in. It's essentially how you would define the goal of life, or as we would say, the meaning of life. Now, some philosophers, such as Aristotle, would say virtue is really important, or having wisdom and certain character strengths. But Aristotle and his followers would say it's also important to have a certain amount of money and property and status in society and so on. And the Stoics adopt a hard line that says the only thing that really matters is wisdom. And they'll point to people like Socrates. They'll say Socrates was ridiculed and persecuted by many other Athenians. He lived in relative poverty, but nevertheless, he flourished. And then they would ask questions like, would Socrates' life have been made better, ultimately, if we gave him more cash? Right? If he was more popular, would his life have been better? And the weird thing is, it's an odd question to ask, because in some ways, what made him so great was that he faced ridicule and persecution, and he wasn't wealthy, and he managed to flourish despite those challenges in life. So the Stoics adopt this kind of radical position that it's these inner qualities, the virtues, that really define the meaning of life. And that's very topical in modern research on mental health.
When we speak of Socrates and some of the other famous philosophers, they discuss the importance of thinking for ourselves, as we've sort of touched on here. And in your book, which you kindly sent me a copy of, How to Think Like Socrates, you have a paragraph that I'm going to read here that I thought really summed this up. And it basically explains how simply seeking answers from other people, from external sources, without asking the appropriate questions can lead to a dangerous dependence on the opinions of others. Yeah. I'll read it here, and then I would like to talk about it if we can. So You wrote, rules work until they don't. Advice is good until it's not. Even the best advice is no substitute for real wisdom. It's healthier, of course, to be able to adapt your coping style to the demands of whatever situation you encounter. Following someone else's moral or psychological guidance is like following their directions through a forest. It only works until you get lost again. You would be much better off in the long run if you could learn how to use a map and a compass. If, that is, you were guided by reason and your own philosophy for life. So I thought that was a really good paragraph and something that really encapsulates what appeals to me about particularly the ancient philosophical thought. Do you have any comments on that paragraph, or want to talk about the difference there between adopting other people's views and your own?
I think it's integral to what Socrates was all about. Like, for Socrates, for some philosophers, wisdom is knowing a bunch of stuff. But for Socrates, wisdom is more like a dynamic process. It's more like a cognitive skill. It's being able to think for yourself, basically. Socrates was concerned about books, right? He thought people, by reading books, would just become passive. They get opinions from books rather than genuine understanding or knowledge, because they hadn't spent time figuring things out for themselves. They would just read books and then parrot what they'd read as if it was knowledge that they'd acquired, when in fact it's something more superficial, which he refers to as opinion. Again, in modern psychology, we're familiar with a similar problem. There's a problem with self-help literature, like which is the kind of angle that I adopted on it. Ironic, Jordan Peterson has an entire book called 12 Rules, where he advocates fairly rigid, rule-governed approach to self-improvement. And Socrates was saying the complete opposite. Many modern cognitive behavioral therapists would question the wisdom of that as well. Because what we usually find is that people in therapy are often using strategies and being guided by rules or beliefs that kind of look like they should work. They seem like common sense, but they're applying them too rigidly. They're taking rules that work in one situation and overextending them to other situations where they don't work anymore. Like, a kind of principle or a rule that you follow in the military might not work that well for you, like when you're trying to interact with your 2-year-old kids, or rules, that help you in your career might not work that well in your relationship with your girlfriend or your wife, for example. So, we have to be flexible. We've got to be adaptive. We have to be sensitive to changes in our environment and use different strategies, and modify the rules that we're following in order to really have emotional resilience, basically. It's very often the case. I mean, research on stress shows this. In some situations, it might make sense for you to practice acceptance. In other situations, it would be a lot better for you to be much more assertive, right? So, we have to learn to differentiate and figure out which strategy to use, rather than just constantly tackling every problem, as if it's a nail and the only tool that we've got is a hammer kind of thing. I mean, someone who's really resilient will have a whole toolbox of coping strategies, and they'll be smart enough, they'll be wise enough to figure out whether to use a hammer or a screwdriver to deal with a particular problem. But you don't get that from most self-help. It's formulaic and just teaches you, you should do acceptance all the time, or you should practice mindfulness all the time, or you should be more assertive or something like that. And it works great until it doesn't.
Yeah.
Right. And the problem is that when people find a strategy that works, they almost kind of they get rewarded by its success. So they almost become quite addicted to it, and then prone to over-applying it. And even when they see that it's not working anymore, they just carry on doing the same thing. There's some situations where, you might think it's a good philosophy of life to always speak your mind. And that might work really well for you until you find yourself in a situation where you should probably keep your mouth shut. Yeah. It'd be much wiser not to speak your mind in some situations, right? But this is how people talk about life. And this is how a lot of self-help influencers talk, as if they have these rules that you can just follow consistently. and it's going to work out for you. Where it was Socrates thought that was far too simplistic, and really, it obscured the fact that you need to develop the ability to think on your feet and adapt to different situations.
I think one thing that's really helpful to think about is you talk about these rules, and you spoke about Jordan Peterson with his 12 rules for life, and they're quite, well, admittedly, I've not read his book, but these rules from, he's a psychologist or social media influencers or whoever, tend to be quite rigid, and it's, you must always do this and you'll meet success. But I think dropping back from the rules and relying on wisdom opens up and puts you in a more receptive state of being as well, where you're really paying attention to the situation and you're absorbing all the facts and you're relying on your own wisdom to make a wise decision in the moment based on what's coming in. And it reminds me a lot of, you touched on Aristotle earlier with his proposal of the golden mean, and quite famously discusses how courage is a virtue. And he explains how the virtue is sometimes between two extremes, and that golden mean, that sweet spot, actually is reliant on the situation that you're dealing with at that time to determine where you sit on that mean.
Yeah. The Stoics view it slightly differently. They think courage needs to be understood differently in different situations, but there's not necessarily a kind of middle point or a mean. And for Socrates, the issue is how we define it. There's a very famous Socratic dialogue called The Lackeys, where Socrates, one of the things that might be worth mentioning about Socrates is people think of him as this guy that hangs around doing philosophy. He's like an old guy with a beard and wears robes, and he walks around pontificating and stuff. But Socrates was a decorated military veteran, or nearly decorated. He kind of turned down the award that he should have had for saving an officer in a famous battle. Socrates was a soldier. He was a warrior. And there's a dialogue where he's conversing with some Athenian generals about the nature of courage. And he asks them, how would you define courage? And they say it consists in standing your ground and remaining in formation. And they're assuming it's primarily about fighting in a phalanx, like the way that Athenian hoplites or spearmen used to fight in formation. And so it's really, really important that you stay in formation, because you're using your shield to protect yourself, but also the guy to your left is protected by your shield. So if you break formation, you're placing yourself and other people at risk by doing that. So courage consists in, even when you're under pressure from the enemy, remaining in this tight formation. And Socrates says, well, that makes sense as a definition to you guys, but what if you were fighting in the cavalry? Because the cavalry charge at the enemy, so they don't remain in formation. What if you were fighting a tactical retreat, which the Athenians had to do sometimes? He says, what about the Spartans? They have a different fighting style where they charge into their infantry charge into the enemy. They don't remain in formation. And, what about in times of peace? You're just assuming courage in times of war, but how would you define, your definition wouldn't make sense in civilian life, for example. So, often Socrates would say, this definition looks good, but it just doesn't apply in other settings, right? And Socrates was actually really adept at a type of creative thinking, almost like brainstorming, where he would kind of spot exceptions to a rule, right? Which was kind of annoying to some people, but I think it allowed him to see beyond the sort of received wisdom of his of the period in which he lived. Yeah, you've got to be able to kind of think quite. It requires creativity, almost like brainstorming, to spot these exceptions. I guess, to use the horrible cliche, he was really good at thinking outside the box.
Yeah. I'd like to talk about some of the techniques, and these are ones mentioned in your book, and they certainly have a flavor of cognitive behavioral therapy to them, but they're grounded in some of the philosophical thought. I've written down 3 that I'd like to talk about because I think they're quite relevant to the type of work I do. Mm-hmm. The first one's cognitive distancing. And you wrote in your book, which I thought really gave a good example of it and a good way to introduce it. You said, Most of the time, we do not look at and examine our own thoughts. Rather, we take them for granted and look at events through them. So could we explore the concept of cognitive distancing and, as a psychotherapist, give some examples on how that might be a beneficial technique to apply in real world?
Well, we use jargon to describe it. I try not to use too much jargon, but the reason that we use this jargon term is that it's not a familiar concept to the majority of people. It's a really important concept in modern psychotherapy, but not one that people recognize at first. Although with a little bit of coaching and a little bit of explanation and training, most people get it fairly quickly. The other term, we also call it diffusion, as well as cognitive distancing. So the idea is, if you looked at the world through coloured glasses, say you're wearing sad blue lenses in your glasses, after a while you might forget that you're wearing glasses and just think, though, the world is sad and blue. That's just how it looks, right? And then you take them off and realize, oh, the blueness doesn't reside in the world. The blueness is in these lenses that were in front of my eyes. But imagine you were now looking through catastrophic tinted lenses, or depression tinted lenses, or hate tinted lenses, right? Because we view the world through biases all day long, every day, right? And certain things trigger our biases and play on them, amplify them. And so cognitive distancing is about noticing the filters or biases that we're applying to our experience and distinguishing between them. So normally the blueness or the value judgments that we make are fused, they're indistinguishable. If somebody's horrible to me, I just think that guy's an idiot, and I see him as an idiot, right? There's a difference between thinking that guy's an idiot and thinking I notice myself saying right now that this guy is an idiot. I notice myself having the thought that this guy is an idiot, right? So I can prize apart my thought from the external event. I can think, no, this is a guy who said this and said that. The idea that he's an idiot is something I'm projecting onto him. That's my interpretation. It's my perspective. And other people might view him differently. Maybe I'm being kind of selective. Maybe I'm being kind of extreme. Maybe I'm making an overgeneralization. Maybe I'm jumping prematurely to certain conclusions about this guy. Maybe errors in my thinking. And so cognitive distancing is when I notice my own thinking, basically, and distinguish or separate. So the distance is the separation between my thoughts, particularly my value judgments, and the thing that they refer to. And, that's why we also call it diffusion, because normally my value judgments or my opinions are kind of fused with my experience. They're all just blended or merged indistinguishably together. And we know that when people can gain this insight, it tends to reduce the intensity of anger and fear and other strong emotions. And it also gives them a lot more flexibility in their thinking, so they tend to become better at problem solving, which usually helps them a lot in the long term.
I think it's really important when you talk about the biases, because in the type of work that I do, we're certainly conditioned over time to have certain biases. One would be to think that, we deal with people doing the wrong thing all day long, more than most. And so that, from just a expectation of probability, can color the expected likelihood of an event going bad, or someone looking to steal or cheat or do the wrong thing. And certainly, first responders don't turn up to near misses, right? So we're always turning up to those events that have actually gone bad. So over time, that conditions you to expect bad outcomes more than probably would be statistically likely. So that diffusion, that assuming that things will turn out bad, or that this person who may have said something a little bit off is a bad person, is something that I see being worthwhile in learning to do. Do you have any techniques on how people might practice diffusion?
Yeah, there are many techniques that we use in therapy. Some of them are actually kind of weird, but they work. Some of the ones that we have the most evidence base are actually the weirdest ones, right? So you can write first of all, noticing what your thoughts are is important. That's a skill in itself. So just making an effort to be more mindful of what the automatic thoughts are that pop into your mind in a stressful situation, and being on the lookout for them, and then writing them down and observing them and thinking of them as if they're someone else's thoughts. And how would you view it if you observe somebody else saying, whatever your automatic... Suppose I say, I just have the thought, like, how dare this guy speak to me? What an idiot, right? So if somebody's kind of a bit off or like, a bit rude or something. And so I can imagine that written on a piece of paper and kind of taking a step back and observing the thought, right, and evaluating it from a more detached way. I can imagine it projected on a wall, like in big letters, and taking a step back. And that allows me to observe the thought and think about the consequences more easily, and maybe also imagine alternative ways of responding and thinking about this. So, I'll give you a really easy example. I might think, what an idiot, how dare he, somebody's a bit rude to me. Someone else might look at this person and just think he's in shock. He doesn't really know what he's saying. Or I might look at somebody who's been a bit rude and think, what an idiot. Someone else might look at them and think, this guy's, a family man. He's done a lot of, generous things in his life. He's just having a bad day, right? And, they're all valid perspectives. Some of them are maybe like more of the whole story than others, though. So learning to view our thoughts as if we were observing someone else have those thoughts can be useful. You could say to yourself, I notice right now that I'm thinking this guy's an idiot. How dare he speak to me like that? And so phrasing it like that and imagining that you're putting it in quotation marks can give you some detachment. You can also repeat the thought more slowly or more quickly. So this is going to seem odd, but in modern research on behavioral psychology, we get people to repeat negative thoughts very rapidly for about 45 seconds aloud. So you might go, how dare he, this guy's an idiot, 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 how dare he, this guy's an idiot. And that feels weird after 5 or 10 seconds. After 45 seconds, it's like you feel very desensitized to the thought. You can still have the thought, but it doesn't have the same emotional effect on you. So you're able to kind of evaluate it more objectively. And a similar thing happens if you slow your thinking down and pause more. So worrying, for example, in slow motion can be an interesting exercise.
I think it's really interesting too. Particularly anger seems to be the one that's hardest to deal with, because there's something so empowering about being angry at someone. There's sort of this righteous sense of anger, as you said. How dare this guy speak to me this way? It's sort of empowering and wants you to take action. It's very difficult to catch it in that moment and think, no, this could just be my way of interpreting the event. Yeah.
I think anger, there are many things that you can do to tackle anger. This is a whole can of worms, because the Stoics had a very radical view about anger, and it's one of my areas of interest. There's a great deal that we could say about it. A good place to begin is, when people say it's automatic and it happens really quickly, we actually have more voluntary control over anger than we normally assume. It's part of the nature of it that we underestimate how much control we have over it. And people will think it happens quickly, but one way of slowing it down would just be to notice the early warning signs, and also notice the stages in the sequence. Be more mindful. In a more intelligent way to distinguish between different aspects of anger. For instance, Aaron T. Beck, who's one of the pioneers of cognitive therapy, wrote a book on anger, and he interviewed in detail many people who experienced anger, got them to keep a very careful record of their thoughts. And he found in almost every case that anger was preceded by another emotion. So sometimes psychologists say that anger is like a secondary emotion rather than a primary emotion. It's almost in some ways like a coping strategy rather in response to anxiety or frustration or feeling hurt. So the cliched thing is that, somebody says something that hurts my feelings, and then I immediately respond by getting angry because it makes me feel more powerful after having felt vulnerable for a moment. It shifts all my attention onto them instead of onto myself and the painful feelings that I'm having. So it's a way of defending our ego, like
Yeah.
potentially, and it's kind of addictive, because it feels good sometimes in the moment, but then people often regret. People feel very justified when they're angry. It's inherently self-righteous in most cases. Anger can vary, but I'm talking about the stereotypical examples. So it's odd that people feel very self-righteous and justified usually when they're angry, but then afterwards they'll often regret like what they did when they're angry. Anger doesn't tend to work out that well in the long run.
I really like that idea of anger being a secondary emotion and spending time to, if you can, through introspection or just taking a moment to try and identify what that primary emotion that you might be responding to is.
If you notice the primary emotion, then you'll introduce more of a kind of gap. You'll slow the sequence down a little bit. And also what Beck used to advise, and I found this with my clients, the simplest piece of advice I could give people is if you can notice what the primary emotion is, like the feeling of hurt, frustration, anxiety, whatever it is, and just try sitting with that feeling, just allowing yourself to give your full attention to it, even though it's painful. It's the opposite of what you normally feel like doing. You normally want to get rid of it as quickly as possible. But if you could just stay with it for 5 or 10 seconds, even longer than normal, that's often enough to derail the cycle of anger.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. And that's going to have a lot of real world value for sure, that technique. The second one is, and I see it having some parallels as well. It's that ability to gain perspective, but it's called the view from above. And you spoke about Marcus Aurelius before, and I know he practiced this quite regularly in his life. I think this could be a real valuable technique, basically because of what we do for a job. It can be quite all-encompassing, and it's very difficult to gain perspective when you're dealing with something at work that's very, very important, and you sort of narrow in on that as being all of the world is this situation at the moment. Yes. Can you introduce the view from above and explain how it might provide some relief from those sorts of situations?
Yeah, Marcus talks quite a lot about this. As a Roman emperor, he had to face a lot of problems, like many wars, famine, plague, civil war, political intrigue, possibly assassination attempts. It wasn't easy being Roman emperor. Many Roman emperors were assassinated, right? It was a pretty dangerous job. And he says that every day he practiced visualizing the world as if seen from some high watchtower, from a helicopter view, we would say, or, more broadly, just expanding your perception of the space, expanding your perception of time, thinking about the wider context in which events occur. You actually hit the nail on the head there. We know now that when people are stressed, angry or anxious, they narrow the scope of their attention. It's like we engage in threat monitoring, and it's like we're putting possible signs of danger or problems under a magnifying glass, which in some ways is useful, but it tends to just amplify the distress that we're experiencing, and it can cause us to overlook signs of safety or possible resources in our environment. So it's another bias, right? Like narrowing our attention is selective attention. It's selective thinking. And the Stoics believed it was important to train themselves to reverse that tendency and to become more aware of the bigger picture. And when we're more aware of the bigger picture, we tend to think more wisely about things. Like we've got more information to base our decisions on, but also we tend to be less upset. We have emotions, but they're not as overwhelming, because the thing that's making me angry is now just one small corner of a much bigger and more complex tapestry. Whereas if I take a magnifying glass and just look at the thing that's making me angry, it becomes all consuming. Like I have tunnel vision for it, that's all I've got going into my brain. So, all I'm going to respond with is anger. Whereas really, if you look at the bigger picture, you tend then to have a more complex and nuanced emotional response, which is healthy.
There was an exercise that Marcus wrote, obviously for himself in Meditations, that I think has aged particularly well. So at the time, and you will know it better than me, but at the time he was writing it, he was reminding himself that all these events and all these people that are well known now will someday be forgotten. And he's listing cities, kings, queens, whoever else. And when he was writing it, he was no doubt referencing people that were so well known at the time, but he was reminding himself these cities, these people will be forgotten in the sands of time. Now, what's crazy is reading it now, I actually have no idea who those people are. So it sort of doubly proved his point that he was actually selecting very famous, very well-known people that and training himself to realize that one day everything they've done will be forgotten. I read it today, no idea who they are. So it's quite powerful to read.
Yeah. And even the ones that we do remember, he mentions, for example, Augustus, who was the founder of the Roman Empire. But no one remembers most of the statesmen and members of Augustus's court. Like, those guys were important movers and shakers in the early Roman Empire. Like, we've forgotten 99% of their names. And the other odd thing is we only have statues of Augustus in his prime. We've no idea what Augustus looked like when he was elderly. Like, we have this kind of very selective image of him. So Marcus thought these were living, breathing human beings. They got up every day. They ate, meals. They had wives and friends and children. Like, now all we have is a statue of them, or like a couple of pages in a surviving Roman history, right? So even the ones that are super famous, we only have a fragment of their lives that remain. And one day, poof, that's going to be gone. One day somebody's going to think of you for the last time ever in the history of the universe. So Marcus, is part of the view from above, is thinking about the whole of time and how small our lives are as part of that entire story, which to some people might, be a depressing idea. But for this, Marcus wanted to emphasize it was important how we use the time that's available to us. Important to be grounded in the present moment and make the most of our opportunity in life, but also at the same time, simultaneously, to realize we're part of a much bigger story. And so, the things that happen to us, in a sense, shouldn't be overwhelming or all-consuming, because they're only one tiny fragment of our lives, and of the story of the human race and the universe as a whole.
Yeah, it's funny. I was chatting to a psychologist friend the other day, and we were having a similar conversation to this, and he said, if you ever find yourself in a cemetery, he goes, there's a real difference between the people who are dead and the people who are really dead. And I didn't initially know what he meant. And clearly everyone in that cemetery is no longer with us. But there would be people around that still know the names of some of the people, which names are written on the tombstones. People would remember their deceased grandparents or great-grandparents, perhaps. But there's people there that died so long ago that the memory of them doesn't even exist today. So they're totally gone. As you said before, there was a moment in time where someone thought about them for the very last time ever in the history of the universe. And that's quite a perspective shift in thinking about the finite time that we have here, really.
Yeah. Yeah, it's humbling, but I think in a healthy way, in a good way.
Yes.
Like this fits within a broader philosophy in Stoicism, which is about placing more value, more importance on the way that we behave from moment to moment, trying to live wisely each moment of the day, but also recognizing, that in the grand scheme of things, like there's much more to the story of the universe than the events that happen to befall us. Like, if someone is rude to me, that might seem like a really big deal. Like, they called me an idiot. They were really rude to me, but it's a tiny drop in the ocean in the story of the universe.
Yeah. The final technique, and I don't really know if there's a name for it, I suppose the ability to have no judgment, or the power within us to have no judgment. There's a quote I've got here from Meditations from, again, Marcus Aurelius, and it says, it's in our power to have no opinion about a thing and not be disturbed in our soul, but things themselves have no natural power to form our judgments. I think in our current society now, where we're absolutely bombarded with news media, and it's shaped in a way that isn't just to inform, it's to create a response, create an emotion in us.
Yes.
It can be quite liberating to have the realization that we don't need to have an opinion or a judgment on everything. Yes. And that's not to say that we need to be apathetic about life, but there really is that sweet spot. Well, what's your opinion on that?
I remember this kind of, golden age when I was like, maybe it was late 1970s, early 80s or something like that. I'm sure I look back wistfully of my youth. And I remember a time when people didn't have an opinion on everything, like that not everybody was an expert in epidemiology, for example. Like, I remember when, like, not everybody was an expert on the economy, but now I think what it goes hand in hand with a sort of cynicism and mistrust of expertise that's developed in the age of the internet. We should question experts. We shouldn't just, like, trust them all categorically. But I think it's very problematic when people assume that they know better than scientists or researchers that have been studying a subject their entire lives. So there's the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Yeah. Like, we feel like we're experts on everything. And the less we know, the more vulnerable we are to overestimating our understanding of a subject. Now, Socrates was very aware of this. He thought the biggest problem in life, Socrates famously said that ignorance isn't that much of a problem, because I know that I'm ignorant about repairing cars, for example, right? It's not a problem. I just go to a mechanic, right? It's not that big a problem, as long as I can find someone to advise me. But the real problem is what Socrates called double ignorance. That's when I'm ignorant about my ignorance, and I falsely believe that I know something that I do not in fact know. And the example that he gives sometimes is if somebody believed that they were a medical expert, when in fact they weren't, and they'd be therefore guided by their ignorance and confusion about a subject, and they might misinform and misguide other people. Like, it's he called that a kind of arrogance or conceit, and he thought that the main function of the Socratic method was actually to try and cure us of this double ignorance, like, that he thought was particularly dangerous. And I think in part it's the product of rhetoric and persuasion, marketing, political oratory, and nowadays, like, social media. The social media works by captivating your attention, and it does that in part by trying to evoke strong emotions, often fear, anger, like craving or desire, greed. And, like, these guys manipulate you for a living. Politicians, people in advertising. So they get up in the morning thinking of ways to manipulate your emotions. Because that's how it works. But they do that in part by getting you to feel like, you know things that you don't necessarily know. Like, you have strong opinions about what would be right for the economy, when in fact maybe you haven't really got a clue, like, how the economy works, right? But you get really angry about it anyway. And so, I think there's nothing wrong with having opinions as long as we know that they're just hypothetical. Like, I reckon, that state-run healthcare is a good idea. I think it works well in Britain. When I worked in the NHS, I got that impression. But I'm not an expert. I'm not a health economist. That's just an impression that I have. I might be wrong about it. What happened? Do you remember the olden days when people used to have an open mind about things like that?
Yeah.
And then that's why they're politically divided into sort of these bubbles on the left and right, I think. Like, they're so fused with their opinions that they can't possibly imagine any alternative way of looking at it. But then we never learn anything either, We have to get back to having, a degree of open-mindedness and curiosity about things. We can't act like we're experts on everything. And I think the Socratic method is really all about helping us to question, reflect on our own opinions in an intelligent way.
I think that might be a really good way to bring into what will be my final question, which talks about living an examined life. We spoke about Socrates throughout the interview, and one of his most famous quotes attributed to him was that the unexamined life is not worth living. Yeah. It might be helpful if we contrast, and we really sort of touched on it a little bit actually in that previous question, but it might be helpful if we contrast what an unexamined life might look like with someone living a more examined life, and then really bring home how someone might take some steps to live that sort of life if they wish.
Sure. Like, so an unexamined life is going to be, we talked earlier about anger, right? If you don't reflect on what's going on between your ears, like, you're going to be like a puppet, like, like a robot. You never take an opportunity to question the assumptions that you're making or the biases that you're exhibiting, then you're going to be a victim of those biases and assumptions and prejudices for the rest of your life. You'll be running on autopilot, right? You'll be in a trance, in a sense, if you never examined your life. You have to question your assumptions and biases in order to wake yourself up and snap yourself out of the trance that you would be in otherwise. But I'll tell you another feature that Socrates was famous for pointing out, that the unexamined life is going to be riddled with contradictions. Like, so one of the things that happens when you start to reflect on and examine your own thinking and behavior is that you notice contradictions. You might notice errors in your reasoning, and you potentially iron those out naturally. We think, like, it cannot both be true. Like, that this is like something is simultaneously true and false. Like, it cannot, two contradictory things cannot be simultaneously true. So we naturally, when we spot contradictions, want to resolve them, like, and figure out a better way of interpreting what's going on. One of the areas that Socrates was aware that happens, that I think is quite important, an obvious one, is that all of us exhibit double standards in our daily lives with regard to our values and our morality. His famous example was a young man came to him and said, "Hey, Socrates, could you introduce me to some influential people?" He was like just embarking on his career, if you like. And Socrates knew lots of people in Athenian society. And he said, "Sure, but first, could you tell me what the qualities are that you're really looking for in an ideal friend?" And this guy, Critobulus, he was the son of one of Socrates' best friends. He said, "Sure, it's easy, a good friend would maybe lend you money if you needed it. They'd maybe challenge you if you were acting badly. They'd come and visit you if you were sick, blah, 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 blah." It's quite easy to say these are all the qualities that a good friend would exhibit. These are qualities that a bad friend might exhibit. And Socrates was like, "Oh, that's awesome. So you've got a really clear idea what qualities you're looking for in an ideal friend. I've just got one question for you." Socrates often starts with an easy question and then hits people with an unexpected one. So then he said, "How many of these qualities do you actually exhibit yourself?" And the answer was, "Not very many, or possibly zero," right? Wouldn't it have made more sense for you to ask me how you could become a good friend to other people first? And then I'd be falling over myself to introduce you to other people. It shouldn't have been more of a priority for you to cultivate those qualities in yourself. So Critobulus was exhibiting a double standard, or if you like, he was a hypocrite, right? In a sense, he hadn't really thought through his own values. He hadn't examined the contradictions in his thinking about friendship. He was very clear what he expected from other people as friends, but he wasn't applying that same standard to his own behavior. And it was fairly easy for Socrates to point that contradiction out. And when he did, this young man became one of his students. He started to think more deeply about, what his goals were in life and the sort of person that he actually wanted to be.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. And it's funny how we, as you said, we live with these contradictions, and we touched at the start when I asked why paying attention to philosophers from a couple of thousand years ago may be more valuable or insightful than speaking to people today. And as you said, they lived a life where their life was conducive to this sort of introspection. They had more downtime, maybe less complication in their life, which allowed them to think these things. One thing I've started to realize is in life how it is now, we really can go from the moment we wake up to the moment we go back to sleep. We've been distracted constantly without carving out 5 or 10 minutes a day to just sit and think and examine our life. It's hard to do from a time and functional perspective, and it's also difficult to do because you might not like the things that arise in those moments. But I do think it's very important.
Yeah, I think Socrates was right as well that part of the reason that ancient philosophers exhibit this kind of timeless wisdom is that they had fewer books and they didn't have YouTube and stuff like that. So when we feel uneasy because we don't understand something, we'll go and look it up in a book, or we'll look it up, or we'll Google it, or we'll look it up on YouTube. Or now we'll just ask AI to think for us, right? We'll ask AI, what should my opinion be about the economy? What should my opinion be about climate change? What should my opinion be like? We'll ask AI and it'll figure it out for us and tell us what to think. Like, but in the ancient world, people didn't quite have that. I guess you could go and ask your friends, but there was more responsibility placed on the individual to try and figure out things for themselves. And that was quite limiting. They didn't have access to anywhere near as much information as we do. But what it did mean, a number of people, anthropologists, have commented on this, that in more primitive societies or in ancient societies, people often seem to be more capable of independent thinking in certain regards because they have to figure stuff out. If I wanted to go out and survive in the wilderness, like, in the forest or whatever, I'd just Google what can you eat and what can't you eat, like how would I build a shelter or whatever. I'd maybe get a book and I'd look it up. In the ancient world, you maybe had to figure that out through trial and error.
Yeah, and I can see how, I touched on before about never being bored or never having to think for yourself, and even just managing that influx of information, telling you these are the rules, these are the ways you need to do things, this will solve all the problems. It really takes your inner thought and just gives it to someone else to deal with. And the argument clearly is that we need to rein that back in somewhat and take some initiative and thinking back for ourselves. So, Donald, look, I think that's a really good spot to finish, and I really appreciate your time. You've written a number of books that I touched on at the start, but if someone who's new to this topic wanted to explore it further, is there one of yours that you think would be the best one to start with?
Yeah, I think either How to Think Like a Roman Emperor or How to Think Like Socrates. What I did in those books was try to write stories about ancient history, about the lives of Marcus Aurelius and Socrates, so that people would kind of find it engaging and entertaining while they were getting some of the philosophical ideas. And we weren't sure whether that would work or not, but we did it, and people seem to like it. People that are into history and into people like the movie Gladiator, for example, like these kind of stories. And it helped those books to reach a wider audience than they might have done otherwise. So yeah, either of those two, I think, would be a good starting place.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I've read both. As I said before we started recording, I've bought your version of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor for 3 friends now, and when they've been going through challenging times, and it's been quite beneficial for them to introduce them to this sort of thing. And as you said, it has a foot in both camps, where we're looking at the lives that some of these people lived, and also some of the teachings or some of the thoughts they had about their lives, and they are very relevant today as well. It's just as much as they were back then. So I'm a big fan of your work, Donald. So look, thanks so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm quite confident that the people listening will get a lot out of this.
Cool. It's been a pleasure. I enjoyed it.